Computer.
Yep.
Yeah, there you are.
Okay, that worked.
Okay, shoot.
And let me just tell her to quit.
And bring your glass forward for this one.
So let's see. Okay, so how much should I introduce myself? I have sort of a diverse background, and I actually have done genocide studies and Holocaust studies on site in the Ukraine and in Poland. So I have to tell you that the genocide hasn't started now. Genocide was prepared since the 1880s. It's called replacement genocide. You move out an ethnic group and you take their place. That is a form of genocide. In December 1947, after they had the fig leaf of the partition proposal, which was rejected by the Security Council, the Zionist leadership put the genocide into full operation, but they had been preparing it for years. So genocide does not mean mass murder. You don't have to do it at the level of the Holocaust. What it means is you eradicate in some way, either by expulsion, it could be murder, or taking all their children in a specific area. But this has always been genocide, and it's always been intended. The international community banned genocide on December 11th, 1946, and made it what's, I see two of you are, I think, are Catholic priests. You know what this means. Jus cogens, I guess. Jus cogens. It's a peremptory international legal norm.
Sorry, just
cannot-
none of us are priests here, actually. No, myself and John Usher happen to be Catholics, but that doesn't make us priests.
Okay, you may have studied Latin, though.
Well, a tiny bit, a long time ago. I think you can.
Okay, well, I'm about the same age as you, so I remember my Latin. So,
Good.
Jus cogens, it means compelling law, means it's a peremptory international legal norm that cannot be abrogated. That means overridden. So the white racist states have been giving Zionists a pass to violate jus cogens since the start. I think that it's beginning to, this impunity is beginning to break down. And that might be part of the reason why it's worthwhile to start pursuing a legal strategy. So I'm going to share my screen.
Good. Oh, sorry. I think I have to allow you to share screen, don't I?
Let's see what happens.
Allow participants to share screen. I think I've done that.
Okay, let's see what happens. Okay, which is desktop 1? We want to share desktop 2 so I can look at it. And let's see what we have here. Let's get rid of this, share. I don't know what it's doing. So do you see my screen?
No.
Try again.
Yeah, but that is.
I've got a tick here beside security share screen.
Okay, I think I can see it. Can you see it?
No,
not yet. No.
Okay. So I have to give Zoom the ability to do it. I hate this. You know, I've done this before.
The Lord
Where'd it
was
go?
very subject.
Ugh.
I'm sorry.
This is security, a Macintosh security issue.
Hmm.
Ah, I got it. So let's see what Zoom does.
It's a cute song. It's all good. The way
Hello. Oh, see.
Well, there's one way of doing that. Emailing the
Yeah, but that'd be hideous.
PowerPoint to Joseph.
And this should be easy.
He was upset. He got out of town.
Yeah, you need to get to another. I know I don't know. Mm.
I want to announce some good news. It's domestic news. The boiler man who just came, just as the meeting started, he has fixed my boiler.
Oh,
Well done.
That's good.
And I thought it was my
he's a
fault.
flying
But he
plumber.
said, no, it's not your fault. The pipes were perished and were letting air into the system.
That's why it was.
So
quick.
my marriage has been saved because Avril's day, my wife Avril's day is off tomorrow. And I was dreading the thought of us sitting with rugs and hot water bottles in the house
Very good. Yes.
for the whole day.
Yeah.
So that domestic issue has been resolved. I better send her a message.
Joseph, I don't know if you agree, but I have an idea how to resolve this. If
No, I think I
Jonathan
found it. I found it. Don't worry.
found it, okay,
Yeah,
so I shut up.
I had to get out of full screen mode for the Mac to allow the permission to come up. Okay,
Okay.
so I may
If not,
have
I
to.
have another idea.
I have to leave and come back.
Sure.
Hideous.
Don't worry.
Jonathan, just one. Oh
He's
no, he's
gone.
gone now.
Great.
If you would, Joseph, that's what I wanted to suggest. If Jonathan would email his PowerPoint to you, then you can share it because you are
Oh,
a
yeah.
host and you could do it easier.
Okay,
Just a suggestion.
I'll send him a wee message.
he's
It's a
gone
good
now.
idea. Ah, that was quick. He's coming back in again. Nice to see you again, Jonathan.
Okay, so can you all hear me?
You can hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, share screen, desktop 2.
Yay!
Well done.
Okay, so
Yes,
let's-
we can see it.
So let's expand this.
That's it.
This all looks terribly legal. I'm afraid neither of our legal members are here today. So
Too bad, because it would have been worthwhile to hear from people who are familiar with British law.
oh yeah, can I just
But-
ask? Could you possibly send a copy of the presentation, and for all of us, but in particular for the two legals who are not present?
Okay,
Thank you very
so
Maybe you can
Yeah,
phone Vince.
much. Phone Vince.
Can you phone
Peter,
Vince? Anybody?
Peter.
Peter, can you phone Vince?
You're muted, by the
Yeah.
way, Peter. So I'm sure he's busy in court or something. Right.
okay,
Okay, go ahead.
so I used to be ultra orthodox and I tried to be a Zionist, and I believed in the Oslo process in 1993, and I actually took some contracts to improve telecommunications in the Palestinian occupied territories. I got there in November, and I was sort of looking around in Hebron, which is El Khalil, and I was outside the Mosque of Abraham when Baruch Goldstein decided to celebrate Purim by murdering worshipers. And I had a crisis. Obviously they had a bigger crisis. I concluded that Baruch Goldstein was the logical conclusion of Zionism. And I also concluded that Zionism had murdered Judaism by transforming it into a program of genocide, which it is. You know, it may not be Holocaust level. It's going to get there though. But replacement genocide is genocide. If you actually read the relevant article in the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, only one of the qualifying clauses even mentions death. And one of them just says transfer children. No one dies. So we're dealing with genocide. The European white states are ignoring their own law, and Palestinians are outgunned. You know, they can protest, and they will, because an 80 to 90% agrarian population will never give up its land. Something that Jews don't understand. We aren't agrarians. We aren't peasant farmers. And they think that Palestinians can just leave, but they won't. They've been there for 2,000 years. They've been there since they practiced biblical Judaism, which is a completely different religion from rabbinic Judaism, which is a Mesopotamian or Babylonian religion, and has only been practiced by descendants of non-Judean converts. You know, it's a Christian fairy tale that the Judeans were expelled by the Romans. Roman exile refers to the transformation of Judaism from a religion practiced in Judea into a religion that only descendants of non-Judeans practice. And I can go into this in more detail because I have actually, you know, I studied the Talmud. The Talmud actually says this, and it says it obliquely, but it does say it. And you know, I studied it in Jewish studies. Everyone knows that there was no Roman exile, of people. Judeans converted to Christianity. That's it. And then they converted to Islam later, which is pretty much, if you're familiar with the history of Christianity, it's more or less Jamesian Judean Christianity. You know, Jesus is Messiah, but he's not divine. That's Islam, a slight variant of it, but it's still obviously the same. And you know, Europeans practiced a form of Hellenistic Judaism until like the 9th and 10th century. So anyway, back to the presentation. Palestinians are outgunned. They're getting killed right and left, murdered actually. What's the solution? It turns out that, and it's obvious that the US is screwing up international law. International law is actually screwed up. You know, the British, for example, did away with their genocide statute and say you have to go to the International Criminal Court. Well, that's stupid if you actually read the Rome Statute, because the International Criminal Court only applies when one of the parties where there is a presumption of genocide actually has ratified or acceded to the statute. So Britain is no longer in compliance with the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. It's pretty disgusting, actually. The US, although it doesn't actually enforce its law, is still in compliance. We weren't in compliance for a long time, or we didn't actually ratify the CPPCG until 1987, and there's a reason for that. If you read the International Convention carefully, the US was engaged in genocide until 1978. They were taking children away from American Indians and transferring them to non-Indian families. Exactly the crime of Rabunek Dzieci, what the Germans did to the Poles, take their children away and raise them as Germans. And it actually is defined this way in, if you read Polish histories, they actually talk about theft of children. So we're bad. We did actually ratify or actually enable, actually sign. We signed it, but we didn't ratify it, and we didn't enable it until 1987. The lead Senate sponsor for the ratification and enablement was, of course, Joe Biden, who pretends not to understand what the statute or the convention mean. The accusing Chinese of genocide in Xinjiang, they may be doing bad things, but they probably aren't committing genocide. Genocide is a very high bar. The Zionists admit it, and they're public about it, even though they claim they're not doing it. And if you read public statements and public documents of the Zionist movement, it always intended genocide. So anyway, Palestinians. So how do we help Palestinians and stop so many Palestinians from getting murdered? Because it's only going to get worse. And I started looking into possible legal actions. The reason is that one of my jobs in the past was working with AT&T legal department, mostly with Title 30.
Hello? You seem to have cut out.
Yes,
He said you're working with AT&T.
Yeah, I was a patent. I was working with their legal department on patents and also on Title 47, which is telecommunications. In the US, we are different from the UK. We regulate the phone network, telegraphy, computer networks via common carriage law. In the US, in the UK, you have specific statutes which regulate networks. I think that's the Communications Act of 2003. I think there's a 2007. You don't do it via common carriage. And we sort of disabled it for networks under I think sometime around, actually in 1996. We distinguish between information services and telecommunication services. So the FCC, except in special cases, only regulates what they consider to be almost instantaneous end-to-end communication, where there's no bailment, intermediate storage. Bailment is a concept of both British and American law. You have possession, but you don't own it. So most of the time when you give like a letter to a common carrier, he has possession of it, but he doesn't own it. Or if you give a package to a shipper, he has possession of it but doesn't own it. He has bailment of it. So this law is all complex, but because I understand it and actually studied it, I began thinking about other things. Alien tort statute. The US allows aliens to bring a civil complaint against any American that takes part in a violation of the law of nations, and this violation causes a tort against the alien. Well, a lot of Americans are helping with the genocide of Palestinians. They're giving money to part of my family, funding settlements in the occupied territories. That is what is called in the Nuremberg Tribunal Germanization. It doesn't become any less a crime and less genocide if you rename it Judaization. It's there in the 1946 indictment. The US actually convicted German Nazis of this crime while it was recognizing the Zionist state in 1948. And it's called the Rusha trial, Rasse- und Siedlungshauptamt trial. But it's part of our precedents, part of our case law, because that was a US tribunal. So it's really, everyone's a hypocrite. But Martin McMahon, who is the guy who should be giving this talk, came up with a way, basically said, why aren't we doing this? And he basically got in touch with a lot of Palestinians and filed a complaint under the Alien Torch statute for genocide, war crimes, torture. And he didn't really do apartheid or persecution, but he did the first three. And he also tried RICO, which is our racketeer-influenced corrupt organization statute. That's a hard one. He eventually dropped it. And so he was the lead attorney at Tamimi v. Adelson, and my relatives were also named as defendants, which they deserved. And I actually called him when I saw that because I wanted to volunteer help, and I sort of became his unofficial expert consultant on genocide law, on Jewish religion, and on Zionist history. So some of the memoranda he worked are, I may be partially responsible. I actually disagree with some of the things he said, but it's not important. He got the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit to agree that the federal judiciary has jurisdiction over such a complaint. We're different than the UK. We have a complex legal system. The first stage to get through, in filing or in getting a complaint to trial is to prove you have jurisdiction, and the opposing party always claims you don't. So, and no one had ever tried this before. He succeeded. He was unfortunately a one-man band. He had a small law office, and he didn't have the millions of dollars that were necessary to do this type of case. It's estimated it costs about $6 million. He worked himself to death and he died. But he did actually he actually has established the precedent that the US federal judiciary has jurisdiction over civil complaint of genocide under the Alien Torch statute. Must be brought by aliens. American citizens cannot bring this complaint. And you might ask, if you were familiar with American law, why don't you file a complaint under the genocide statute, which Biden helped pass? It doesn't establish a cause of civil action for tort. So that was his cleverness. He essentially brought a charge of genocide on the basis of the Alien Tort statute, even though this tort does not exist according to the US statutory code. Very clever. There are other things that you can do besides the Alien Tort statute, JASTA, which is the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act. It is extremely confusing. No one actually understands how it works. It's before the Supreme Court right now, and it actually seems to make it illegal to help the civilians in an area which is controlled by terrorists. Seems to make that a crime, even if the federal government tells them it's okay to do this. The Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act allows you to go after American citizens and American organizations which are helping foreigners violate the international law of expropriation. It is defined, basically helping, settlements in the occupied territories. And there are lots of 501c3 organizations in the US which are collecting money just to set up settlements, Judaization, that are in violation of the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. By the way, these are all Holocaust-related acts. JASTA, actually JASTA was specifically to help Israel, but we can use it for Palestinians. Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act changes were made to help Holocaust victims. But, at the same time, Nazis were expropriating Jews. The Zionist colonial settlers were trying to dispossess Palestinians. The law doesn't specify ethnic group. Common carriage law. That basically tells us that you can't discriminate. This is very important because Zionists are basically pressuring all the social media platforms to ban anything pro-Palestine, whether you're an activist or it's your content. Public accommodation law. We have something called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If you are a place of public accommodation, you cannot distinguish on the basis of race, religion, ethnicity, or national origin. The federal courts have traditionally said it has to be a physical place. Is the internet a physical place? No, it's not. But the statute makes an exemption if something is state supported or supported by state action, which refers to a legal doctrine. Then it only need be like a place or as a place. That's how we desegregated drinking fountains, because they're not really a place. It's just a valve on a water supply and doesn't fit into the list that the Civil Rights Act provides. Public forum law. The United States has traditional public forums like a park, a beach, a street, a sidewalk, and it can designate a public forum, but it sort of has to have ownership of it. Well, guess what? Most of the networks in the internet, at least in the USA, are owned by the federal or state governments. And essentially when Twitter, Facebook, or any other social medium starts discriminating against Palestine, that's trespassing. It's like if you went into a park and set up your own private public forum, saying like everyone in the neighborhood but blacks can come to this park and we can have a meeting. That's trespassing in US law. And then there's the state action doctrine. When a state, and it's been extended to the federal government, we have this ridiculously complex system. States are under a little bit different law from the federal government. If the state government gets inextricably intertwined with a proxy, a contractor, then that proxy must obey the same laws that the state obeys. State action doctrine. So, I mean, the archetypical example is Delaware had a parking garage, and they leased out part of their building to a coffee shop, which discriminated against blacks. Now think about this. If the Delaware had set up its own coffee shop, it wouldn't have been able to discriminate against blacks. That's the 14th Amendment, equal protection. So it got a proxy to do it for the state. And the Supreme Court said, oh no, you can't do that. You are inextricably intertwined with this coffee shop. So that's Burton. So, and then that's all federal stuff, except for common carriage law, which can be state. We have, and the UK also has group libel. And, it's a lot harder to prove in the US. You can have some attorneys who want to volunteer their time. I believe that if a Zionist organization claims that they descend from people who were expelled from Judea in Roman times, they are implicitly saying we are the illegitimate inhabitants and Palestinians are not the legitimate inhabitants, in order to normalize, justify, or legitimize genocide. That's harm. So it's a lie plus harm. That's libel. It may be implicit, but I believe both the UK and US states, because libel is a state offense, tend to recognize that you can implicitly libel someone. Then there is Title VI. If an organization receives money from the federal government, as the United States Holocaust Museum does, that organization is prohibited from excluding from participation in, denial of benefits of, and discrimination under any federally assisted program. So I would like, and this actually requires more than just law, set up a permanent genocide, Nakba genocide exhibit at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Now, they will either permit it or they won't. If they permit it, it's great. That's 2 million visitors per year that would see the Nakba exhibit and realize that Zionists are committing genocide and have been. They planned it since the 1880s, prepared for it, and then put it into full operation in December 1947. If they refuse it, it would be a great case. We get all federal funding to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum stopped, and it would probably shut it down, which I actually think is kind of wrong. We should have a slavery museum first before we have a Holocaust museum, because that's a crime we did. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is a feel-good exhibit. And in truth, they lie because they pretend that the United States stopped the Holocaust when it was actually the Soviet Union that stopped the Holocaust. So it's all around bad, bad history, bad mentality, and it's used for propaganda for Zionism. The last law is the Administrative Procedure Act. The US DOJ and the ICE, our Immigration and Customs Enforcement Division, are selectively prosecuting and selectively enforcing the law. Genocide is a federal crime. There's good reason to believe that American Zionists under US jurisdiction are conspiring, inciting, and participating in an ongoing genocide. Why isn't the DOJ basically arresting them, indicting them on probable cause? And this stuff is all obvious. There's obviously been a decision somewhere along the line that American Zionists can operate with impunity. That's a policy decision. Policies like that have to be made open in the public. And if they aren't, there's a violation. And you can go through a very complicated procedure. This one is almost as expensive as a genocide civil tort. Administrative Procedure Acts are complex and expensive, but it would probably be one. Title 42, Common Carriage Law, Foreign Sovereign Immunity are relatively inexpensive. And in some cases, the federal government must help you with common carriage law and public accommodation law violations. So I am probably screwing up. Let's see. Wrong place there. Okay, so I started my own case. Martin died, and I'd done all this work. We'd actually done all this work on the social media platforms, because it is sort of cheap. And we called it the 9th Amendment Challenge to Social Media and Platform Discrimination as a pro-Palestine user and its content. We have to get the message out. There is another constitutional amendment besides the first, which gives you freedom of speech, the 5th, which gives you a due process, and the 14th, which gives you equal protection and due process at state level as opposed to federal level. The 9th Amendment gives Americans all the rights that existed at the time of the ratification, but are not enumerated in the Constitution or in the amendments. And the right to non-discriminatory common carriage is one of those rights, because all the states had it at the time of the ratification. So that's what it says, the enumeration. Certain rights should not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's why we have the right to sue for libel. It would seem that the First Amendment protects a person's right to libel another person. It's freedom of expression, obviously abridged. Well, every state recognized the right to sue for libel at the time of ratification. So no, there is no right to libel someone. There's no right to spread obscenity either, or fighting words, things like that. Those are all crimes. And basically common law common character rights are important because many states have a statutory penalty. We need to be able to discuss this either in the US, UK, Germany, France. Germany is actually enabled, has a correct genocide law according to the CPPCG. And the reason why denial of common carriage is such a great violation, it's self-evidencing, and the social media platforms actually tell you that you've been banned. And common carriage anti-discrimination law, the gift of Great Britain, is the starting point for all anti-discrimination law. It's the root and origin. That's what a common carrier is. Holds out carriage to the public on standard terms for a reasonable fee, which may be money, barter, or work. You actually do all three for a social media platform. So, and these are the precedents from British law. He explains who a common carrier is and points out that a common carrier has to serve all comers. If he wrongfully refuses to accept the consignment, he is suable in tort. And these, in some states, every violation has a fine. It's usually small, but if you're banned from a social media platform, that might be 40 tweets or 4,000 tweets or whatever that you were denied common carriage. That grows really, really fast. And here are the attempts to regulate. Florida and Texas have actually their own new common carriage statutes. They're very complex and somewhat obscure. Massachusetts has a very simple but correct common carriage law, which has been used to regulate common carriage, including telegraphs and telephones since the 19th century. It was enacted in 1869. There is a reason for this. Telegraphs were discriminating against their customers, especially newspapers. And one newspaper would pay a telegraph company not to carry another newspaper's news reports. That's bad. And the states, New York was actually the first to make that illegal under a common carriage statute. Most of those statutes have gone away, unfortunately, but Massachusetts general law, and we are the most like the British, and California Civil Code still have these statutes. California is in some respects even better because it explicitly defines a common carrier of messages. There's also a federal statute. I mentioned that the US government has distinguished between telecommunications services and information services. And the FCC nowadays only regulates telecommunications common carriage, except for this one statute, which refers to general common carriage over wires, not telecommunications common carriage. I believe it's there to handle telex and email. Telex doesn't exist anymore, but email, is really exactly the same as a social media platform. I mean, think about it. You give a message to a email service. It gets stored on the backend server until someone requests it. That's what a social media platform does. You enter in a post, a comment, a tweet you give it to the social media platform. I mean, you may not understand how it works, but the social media platform, basically sends a web page to you. It's social media platform software. And that web page collects your text and then sends it to the back end. But as soon as you enter the text, you have handed it to the social media platform, either on your mobile device or on your desktop. I haven't gone through the UK statutes in detail, but I believe you may actually be in the same situation, though not carried, called a common carrier. So in my draft complaint, which I want to turn into a class action, and because I'm a patent agent, I can't do it. I have to find an attorney. This is what I consider the current, what each common carrier defendant in my draft complaint owes me, the $50 fine or the $500 fine, at least 300 million or 3 billion. And a class action suit, obviously this becomes astronomical, and none of the platforms can do this. We can negotiate a deal. And explain why it has to be a class action. Because a court, and the Supreme Court recently addressed this point, will worry about destabilizing a major industry. A class action could overcome this worry by showing that a social media platform violates the constitutional rights of a huge class of Americans. And by the way, this is general, anyone who has been suspended from a social media platform has a claim under common, either federal and possibly state common carriage law, huge number. Certainly all Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and Christian Americans, and they also are representative for all non-Europeans. There's a lot of evidence that the social media platforms discriminate against non-whites in general. Whites can say almost anything, but a black, if he says that there should be reparations, he's considered to be offending community standards. Well, if you think about it, that's the public accommodation issue. A restaurant that refused to serve blacks could say serving a black would offend community standards, would be a violation of community standards. I mean, this is all horrendous. The current case law in the United States essentially vitiates all anti-discrimination law. The bad guys haven't realized it yet. The restaurant doesn't want to serve blacks. He can set up a social media platform front end where you have to basically show your driver's license so it knows you're a black, and then deny you membership. You won't be able to get a reservation for the restaurant. It's all hideous. So that I discussed this. So we're not talking about just denial of common carriage. The Civil Rights Division is supposed to help with public accommodation discrimination and possibly civil rights discrimination. Public forum trespass, that again is a DOJ issue. It's also a state issue. And these are the relevant civil rights statutes. They're from the Civil War period. So basically, contracts have to be enforced the same way. If your contract refers to community standards without explaining it, it's an ipso facto violation almost. It means you can do anything, you can discriminate against anyone. Conveyance is not exactly common carriage, but when we deal with unpublished, digital unpublished literary property, conveyance and common carriage are almost the same. So and by the way, this is something in British law, and civil action for denial, the deprivation of rights, when a state here or the federal government sets up a website through a social media platform that a Palestinian, or me, because I'm an anti-Zionist Jew, and Zionists discriminate against us, I can't access it. It's clear equal protection. It's a clear, due process and equal protection violation, because I might be trying to get due process through the website that the state has set up on a social media platform. It's all hideous. And this discusses in more detail the public accommodation. What's the problem? It points out exactly where in the statute, which is 42 U.S. Code 2000A, something that's supported by state action is as a place of public accommodation. It doesn't have to be a physical place. It lists restaurants, movie theaters, hotels. I'm sorry, there's a doctrine called a justem generis, means that if a statute gives a list but it's not exhaustive, anything that's like those. The public water fountain is not a restaurant. You're not sitting down and getting food. You're just drinking water, which is not really food. So it might be a component of water. So that's how we desegregated fountains. Oh, and very important, premise, it refers explicitly to premises, which include grounds and appurtenances. Appurtenances include wiring, the issue in our telecommunications law. Wiring, message transport over wiring. No one is connecting the dots. And I understand that telecommunications law was a specialty field, and AT&T had all the experts back in the pre-breakup days. No one really fully understands it anymore. I'm actually the last member of the AT&T legal team. I was the youngest, and I'm almost 70. Everyone else is dead. It's actually quite depressing. So, is the internet a public forum? Well, if you go read the statute, which the courts claim says that a social media platform can remove anyone they want, the first two clauses tell us that the internet is a public forum. It also tells us that the government is inextricably intertwined with the internet in another clause. A social media platform owns very little of the internet. The US government and everyone else own practically all the internet. I mean, within the US. Obviously, non-Americans also own their portion of the internet. The social media platform does not own the wires and devices it uses to discriminate against Palestinian Americans. In fact, that's a big difference between a social media platform and a cable caster or a cable provider and the telephone network. AT&T was always careful, and I believe this is true for British Telecom or the British Postal Service in the old days. I think it was British Postal and Telegraph Service, Telephone and Telegraph Service. They owned everything, including your phone. You rented that. They owned everything from the CPE, the customer premises equipment, the whole network to the other end. You didn't go over anything that wasn't owned. Your voice wasn't carried on anything which wasn't owned by them. So, statutory regulation in the UK said you can't discriminate. Common carriage law in the US said you can't discriminate. Why they think that a social media platform should be able to discriminate on an infrastructure that it doesn't own, it boggles the mind. And here's my goal, or why I think that we can do this, at least in the US, and I'm working on this. It's well documented against Palestinian Americans. There's also a good documentation against other classes of Americans. I'm helpful because I'm Jewish, and I accuse them of anti-Semitism at the same time that Palestinians can accuse them of racial, ethnic, and national and religious discrimination, cover all the bases. And I want to consolidate all the causes of action into one omnibus lawsuit to overwhelm the court and the jury with we still have, I'm not quite sure where jury trials are in the UK, but we still have it as a constitutional right with the magnitude of the violation. And if it's really good, we can get a 3-judge panel under the Civil Rights Act, which means that the Supreme Court doesn't even have the right, if it's appealed, it goes directly to the Supreme Court and not to a circuit court of appeals. It's very complex, but I think it's cheap because the evidentiary issues are actually relatively minor. The real complexity is venue and jurisdiction. Exactly, I'd like to combine Massachusetts common carriage law with Texas law. Now, if we could get enough money out of this suit, then we have the $6 million to go back to the genocide suit and then maybe the Administrative Procedures Act. So, I've been obsessed with this stuff since 1994. I think it can be done. I have to explain this because the attorneys that understood all of this stuff have died. And that's part of the reason why a social media platform is getting away with this crap. The other reason is it's incredibly corrupt. If you look at the news reports, both the Biden and the Trump administration were using their clout to manipulate the social media platform to do what they wanted to do and pretend they weren't inextricably intertwined with the social media platform. It didn't work with AT&T. AT&T was a common carrier. When someone came to it and said, when a government official said, oh, you have to cut off this guy's service, AT&T said, no, we're common carriers. We're not going to cut off anyone's service. We're not going to jeopardize our status. Now, there are issues that do remain, like what about pornography? Obscenity isn't allowed, but not every sexually explicit video clip necessarily counts as pornography. It turns out that a common carrier can have multiple tiers of service, and you can also decide what's unfit in a content neutral fashion. So if you decide that you're a children's social media platform, you don't have to carry pornography. If you're Facebook or Twitter and you want to, or Quora, or one of the ones that does do it, well, you can have a different tier for that. And basically a person can choose to be on the PG or mature or R or whatever it's called, G tier, and you won't see the pornography. This stuff has long been worked out, but it needs to be cracked now so that we can get the message out to the public. Because I don't think that the Zionist state could survive an open public discussion of what it's doing and what the connection is to Christianity. I know that I took a lot of courses in comparative religion at Harvard. I know that Christian restorationists are somewhat, are idiots and believe that rabbinic Judaism has some connection to biblical Judaism. It doesn't really, much less than Orthodox Christianity or Islam. It's a Mesopotamian religion. The people who practice it have no ancestry in Judea. Christian restorationism actually is almost a way to create the exile, the physical exile of Judeans that never happened. If you want to go read Revelation, it seems to be saying that the beasts are leaders of Christian Zionists, and maybe Biden, the president of the United States, who are making war on those who keep the covenant and to keep the law, and those who have the testimony of Jesus. Those are the Palestinians. If you really want to argue with a Christian restorationist or Christian Zionist, as they like to call themselves now, they're basically, if you want to basically think about it from their belief system, they're guaranteeing that they will, after death, spend an eternity in hell. I mean, I'm no longer religious, but they are. That's what they think. That's the logical conclusion of their thoughts. Everything is completely wrong, but we're seeing a crack. It's time to push it open and maybe get enough money to fight this battle so Palestinians can stop dying, which makes me so upset. So that's my whole presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a round of applause called for. My head is spinning. I think basically, I'm very encouraged. And my head is spinning because of all the legal stuff. Once people start talking legal, I find my head goes into brain fuzz. No, that's extremely impressive, the efforts you're making to use the word genocide and to speak out clearly as a Jew or an ex-Jew about this topic and a systematic approach to addressing the issue using, are you a lawyer? using your skills.
So I'm a patent agent, but I used to work with a lot of lawyers.
Yeah,
And
right.
my argument in the social media platforms is almost completely technical. I
Yeah.
don't even have to mention Palestinians.
Yeah.
Because, you know, Palestinians are radioactive here.
Everywhere. Can I just check the term you use? We would use a term here called paralegal or a legal executive. What was the term? Is a pad something?
I'm a patent agent. I'm in the UK.
Oh,
I might be
patent,
a
sorry,
half lawyer.
a patent agent. Yeah, patent agent. So yes, you'd be well familiar with you know, you're basically a lawyer, really, aren't you? In practice.
In one area.
Yeah,
Title
yeah.
35.
Yeah. Oh no, that's fantastic. No, no, I am most impressed. Now I think it's over to the rest of the room to make
So I'm
any
going to stop
questions or
sharing.
questions. Sorry.
I stopped sharing so you can see me again.
Yeah, but I
Well,
see it. So, any other
Thank you.
any
Yes.
reflections, thoughts?
Yes, please.
Okay,
Yeah, please
so Eva,
allow
you
me to-
first, I think. So yes, Eva.
You have to allow my
Thank-
video. So I was
No, we
testing.
can't see you, but we can hear you, and that is all
Okay.
right, as long as you can hear us.
Okay, the host can allow my video if you want.
Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry. Excuse me. Shall we end your presentation, or do you want to continue your recording?
Oh, man, I would like to have a complete recording because
Okay, fine.
I'm going to start presenting this, you know, these ideas to potential
Sure.
investors.
So
You
what
know,
should I
law
do?
is an investment in the US.
Right. I'm just wondering which thing here to press so we can see you again. Allow participants to share screen. So yeah.
Maybe you have to turn that off.
Let's just see. Any tips from anybody? I've got a list here of allow participants to share screen, chat, read in, unmute themselves, start video. Start video, will that do it?
Yeah, that's what I want to do.
Okay, I think I've allowed
There
you.
it is.
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your help.
Good,
Excellent. Eva, over to you.
thank you. But your term, it boggles the mind, was very apt. I think it boggled the mind in its size, in its proportion, because what you're saying is happening illegally everywhere. That people who say a peep about support of Palestinians are immediately deplatformed, called anti-Semitic. Their career is sometimes terminated by who do that. We call it the Jewish lobby. My question is, if this extent of deplatforming people is so vast as you describe it, violating all these statutes and laws that you have told us about, which I have never had an idea about, how come that is not taken up to the extent as it ought to, and that you, Jonathan, have single-handed to sue you? Why are not other people rallying around you and say, this is illegal, we are not having it? And the second question is, who in your assessment is preventing that from doing? Because I don't have very much hope that you will be very successful in the short run, to be honest with you, and possibly you haven't either. So who is preventing?
Well, first, let me explain why this particular argument is rarely made. Title 47 and common carriage law predate the internet, and everyone thinks it's wonderful and new. It's not. You know, in the early days of telegraphy, people thought it was so wondrous that it shouldn't be regulated by common carriage law. And look at the precedents that I'm citing. But common carriage of messages was already in existence in the 17th century. The case law is there. You know, we don't terminate a law or a statute because it's old. You know, the Second Amendment gives you the right to bear weapons. It doesn't give you the right to bear late 18th or early 19th century weapons. It gives you the right to bear arms of today. We have the argument has to be framed in a way that a court understands it. And so far, I think I've been the only party to one of these lawsuits that actually understands the technology. It's scary, isn't it? Who's stopping this from happening? Well, as I pointed out, the executive has an interest in corruption, and obviously there are lots of Jewish lobby lawyers who understand what the issues are, or Israel lobby lawyers. I refer to the Alien Tort Statute. It's been around since the first Congress. Wasn't called 1350 back then. Which group is the most actively trying to repeal it? The Israel lobby, because they understand what it means for them. If you, I can go further on this, but maybe that's not. Are there other people who want to ask questions?
Yes, I mean, yes, I think that's, we would want to give everybody an opportunity to either make a comment or to ask a question.
I have logorrhea. I can babble on for hours.
Yes, it's a common.
Peter has his
problem for
hand
activists.
up.
Yes. Any other? Peter? Yeah, Peter.
Well, yes, thank you very, very much. I've learned a lot, but I did know a little bit about those things, particularly about the Babylonian Judean Jews, if you want to call them that. But I use the social media a phenomenal amount. I've also been a victim of being blocked umpteen times from different groups, etc. Just wondering whether you have any small pieces, you've written pieces, or which I can use and spread on the social media. People can only take so much, a few paragraphs at a time. There's some reason of what you were saying.
Yeah, I've been creating a Quora site for this. I've been doing it under my pen name because I want to protect my family that I was using when I was in Hollywood, and everyone uses a pen name. So, but I will, if you send, I'll distribute my email and also distribute my presentation, the draft complaint, if you really want to see how this all works. And I'll also point out the Quora site where I've been writing this stuff and explaining it. And I usually source and I point to the proper references in the Talmud. I mean, nowadays it's so easy. When I first became upset with Zionism, I would have to enter in all this stuff in mixed Hebrew and Aramaic and English. Now it's all there on the website. You just have to know where to look, and I know where to look. I can point you to everything that you need.
Great. Yes, I mean, a practical note. So if you can send us a copy of your presentation today, and certainly I should pass it on to the two lawyers in particular, but also just very, you've used a lot of legalese, which in a very good way, but for the general audience, I think it's great to know in the British Isles, Ireland and England, and Europe, that what you're doing, there's the formative thing, which you're actually doing a thing. Whether you succeed or not is a separate issue. But the very fact that you're taking action through legal channels to address this issue is really encouraging to us. And if you could do a very brief, and when I say brief, I mean 150, 400 word, very brief summary of what you're doing that could be understood. And I could talk here about basic
anti-discrimination law. I mean, it's in the UK.
In a way, that what I would suggest, if you want us to sell something to general, is that could be understood by an 11-year-old.
I know. I've tried.
You know what I'm saying? Because apparently, I've done a lot of research about public relations, and apparently, if you want people to understand things, that's the level which you're addressing it to. So you're talking about, I don't know what it is, sixth graders or something, a level of, and I think that's helpful because, I'm an overeducated person, not in the legal sense, but medical sense. But what you've told me, I can see that it's well thought through methodically and in detail, but for the general audience, we need something just a little simpler and quite short. But that was extremely encouraging to our group. Any other questions or comments, John or Donald?
Okay, I'll ask a question.
Okay, Burgess.
Jonathan, thank you. Yeah, thank you for very valuable presentation. As it's said that none of us is a lawyer, and we were lost halfway, but I think we got the gist of it. But I'd like to ask you a question. Every time an Israeli politician or anyone is asked the question, what right do you have in actually colonizing Palestine? The answer standard on television, ministers, ordinary people, it's in the Bible. And because it is in the Bible, it must be true. And because it's in the Bible, it's a holy writ. Consequently, we have to accept it. You made the distinction between pre-Roman Judaism and post-Roman Judaism. Now, how is the Old Testament viewed? Do they still share the same scripture, the pre and post-Roman?
Well, I have to ask you, you're Christian. What is your holy scripture?
My holy scripture, I haven't got one, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, someone who's Christian, religious, which is the primary holy
Christian,
scripture?
well, yeah, but again, the
It's
Jews.
the New Testament. It's the New Testament.
Yeah.
The Old Testament is the backstory. When
Yeah,
I was
sure.
religious, my holy scripture was the Babylonian Talmud. The Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is the backstory, much less important. You spend all your time on the Talmud. Now, more important for when they say, "Oh, God gave it to us," you have to go read Jeremiah. The covenant was rewritten because it explicitly, I think it's Jeremiah 30 or 31, Lamed, yeah, 30. It explicitly says, once upon a time, there was a covenant of the land. You were exiled. Our mercy, we brought you back. The covenant doesn't exist. Now you must essentially bathe your piety towards God and righteousness toward your fellow man. Obviously, Zionism isn't doing this, but the land has been taken out of the covenant. You know, that's the final statement of the covenant in Jeremiah. Anyone who focuses only on the Pentateuch is an idiot. He doesn't know his Bible, or he's mendacious.
Thank you.
Well, they
we've
always hammer on Genesis 15.
Well, that's like Abraham, isn't it? That's not even the children of Israel.
Yeah.
Can
Moses exiled from the Nile to the Euphrates. That is what we get.
It's gone. It says only for an age. The age is over. It only exists olam, for an age. It's often translated in modern Hebrew as forever, but that's not what it meant. That's not what it meant in biblical Hebrew. Cyclorum in Latin, for an age for all ages. The ancients thought about this differently than we do. Like when they talk about Ha'am HaYehudi, it's blasphemous from the standpoint. That means Am is people, but not really people, throng, and voluntarily assembled congregation, I guess would be the best in English translation. When you refer to Ha'am HaYehudi instead of Am Yisrael, you're blaspheming, because there was no covenant with Judah. The covenant is only with Israel, and that covenant is over, according to Jeremiah. So you're using a wrong term. I mean, you can get into this more interesting. When they were creating what I call now fake invader Hebrew, they took a lot of the meanings or meaning space, from German. And was made equivalent to Volk in German, like when you say das arische Volk, the Aryan race, but that's not what it means. If any of you know Greek, have studied koine, is always translated as Laos, which means a covenant, basically not a race or an ethnos. Ethnos is a word in Greek. Laos is a voluntarily assembled throng, whatever. When it's doesn't have anything to do with race or ethnicity. It's one of those words in Greek that, so, if, the old Hellenistic Jews, they used to distinguish between themselves, the Laos, and all the Gentiles. In modern Yiddish and Hebrew, we talk about the Goyim. We don't talk about ourselves so much because we essentially butchered Hebrew. So, Rabbinic Judaism, Goyim versus Jews. And in Laos, us, versus non-Laos, the Goyim, which doesn't really exist in Koine or Judeo-Koine. But it's the same idea. I'm Yehudi is garbage. It's not a religion, it's actually a blasphemous phrase in Hebrew. And the old rabbis would have been upset. In truth, the guy who essentially created Rabbinic Judaism, Saad Gaon, before him, the theology of Rabbinic Judaism didn't exist, hated the term Yahadut, Judaism based on Judea. He wanted to use Yichud, monotheism, because it's not an ethnic religion. That's crap. Actually, it's the same Arabic at Tawhid, monotheism. That's essentially what the Salafis like to call Islam. And I'm talking about the quietist ones, not the ones who want to commit terrorism. They're usually not Salafi. So, this ethno-religion stuff is all garbage. My mom was a Jewish Berber. I mean, I'm not dark the way she is. She's barely white, probably not white to a racist. My father's Ukrainian Jewish. They had nothing in common, really. It's not one people. I mean, their practices of religion were radically different. When I'm with my father's family, I have to behave completely differently from when I'm with my mother's family. And my grandfather on my mother's side was actually a recognized posek, decisor, just like an Ashkenazi posek. But being a scholar doesn't say anything about your ethnicity or your culture or your social behavior.
Fascinating. I mean, we're having a great discussion here because we are an interfaith group, and sometimes I forget that. I mean, you've addressed these two topics we discussed today. One is your fantastically well organized, well thought through, and coherent approach, drawing on many strands to address the genocide of the Palestinians. That's fantastic. We've moved on to another topic, which I wish we could discuss like this more often, and that is issues relating to the Old Testament. Now, we have been trying for years, and I've certainly been trying for years to get somebody from a Jewish background to have this sort of discussion. We just haven't had it. And I'd love you to come back and talk about.
I can always talk Rashi with you if you want. I mean, the Bible is for children and for women. I mean, it's not the major focus of Rabbinic Judaism. You teach this to kids. I mean, I started reading when I was, I guess, 3 or 4.
Sure.
It's simple. It's the simple stuff. When you get older, like around 11 or 12, 13, you start learning the Talmud and you start focusing on commercial law, because Rabbinic Judaism is essentially a domain-specific religion, which is for people who are in commerce or finance. We don't think of religion that way, but it wasn't so. In India, each caste, the place in society, essentially has a different religion. There's the warrior's religion, there's the merchant's religion. Rabbinic Judaism is like that. That's why it did so badly with modernization. There was no place for this pre-modern.
Would you like to come back? I mean, I'm just thinking, I don't know what the other people in the group think. I would love you to come back
Same
and have
here.
this discussion
Mm.
about the way, what you've just been talking about, just to have more time to get into in depth, talk about the Old Testament and the way you've talked about rabbinic Judaism. That'd be really helpful and informative to our group. If you'd like to
Sure.
do that as a
And
separate.
not next week. I have other stuff to do for the next couple of weeks.
Sure. And I
Starting
can
a new
see that you're a
contract.
person who, when you do something, you like to do it spot on and perfect. But really, that's been fascinating, that part of the discussion. Any other comments or thoughts?
Yeah, just
Sorry, Donald.
a
is it?
final, very short
Oh,
point.
Burgess.
You talked about the Talmud being Mesopotamian. Yes, I mean, if you read Mesopotamian mythology and practices, you find present Judaic, or whatever you want to call it, practices like the Sabbath. The Sabbath is 100% Mesopotamian. There's no question about that. The king was not allowed to ride his chariot. The physician wasn't allowed to examine or treat the patient, etc., etc. So you think that the Talmud is much later, obviously, and it's got a Mesopotamian source. The other point is, as you know, Hebrew and Arabic, the words, just the root, the vowels are not written, and vocalization came much, much later. So how much of it is actually still a genuine document?
Well, I mean, there are people who worry about the documentary hypothesis and all these issues. There is actually a more recent theory which argues that essentially the Persian Empire, the Achaemenids, were trying to project soft power with the Zoroastrian religion, and they basically wanted to spread, Zoroastrianism into the Levant without need to conquer it, just bring them religiously into the fold. And we have signs of this in the Bible. I mean, obviously, if you read, let there be light. Well, this is, the Lord, God is essentially being equated, Yahweh is being equated with Ahura Mazda, who is actually the Lord of wisdom, but that's also metaphorically light. And, there is basically light versus the darkness. And if you get into it, basically you had a competition, Levant, between El Kon Arts, El who creates the earth, and El Yahweh, the biblical high God, who makes the world, who makes everything, causes everything to exist. But exactly how this got to be the Bible, that's a complex issue. And we have the documentary hypothesis, which says that it was assembled from multiple sources. I actually sort of like the hypothesis, which claims it was written in Alexandria. There are clear parts of the Pentateuch which essentially which are basically rewritten mythology that you find around the Mediterranean. Abraham seems to be equated to an Egyptian or a Greek god, and you have there, Abraham is married to 3 women, Hagar and Sarah and Keturah, right? And that is, basically, Athamas has 3 wives. Obviously, Athamas is Adam, but they get mixed up because, the red man of Hebron was Edom, which is sometimes Esau, but the cave of the cave of Machpelah is associated with Abraham. So Adam and Abraham are sort of conflated in the mythology, but the big issue is that a lot of it is tempered Greek, and it really is Greek mythology that you see in the Old Testament. And I can go through this. So it's probable or possible, depending on position that at least the Pentateuch was written in Alexandria, where you see the blending of, Levant religion with Greek religion, because, Alexander built this city and it had a lot of Phoenician residents. Phoenicians are just Canaanites, just like the Judeans, the Philistines, Palestinians, whatever, and Greeks. There were a lot of Greek colonists, and they were also they were fascinated by monotheism, but they wanted to essentially naturalize it to Greek thinking, and that's where you get the Hebrew Bible. They now think that the Hebrew Bible, the Pentateuch, is actually relatively recent, and there's a pre-biblical monotheism that was brought from Mesopotamia. After all, Abraham says that he's a wandering Aramean. Now, what does that mean? He's coming from the east, right? Ivry, across the river, over there. So the Bible tells you this if you read between the lines. And I don't know how much you read ancient texts, like the Straussians, but pre-modern philosophical and theological texts have to be read between the lines, which, by the way, you learn to do if you study in a yeshiva or a masifta or kollel. No one does that anymore because the number of Jews who actually study in a yeshiva, in a sense, is dwindling. It doesn't have the relevance it used to have because, we don't do pre-modern commerce and finance anymore. It's all being, modernized. So people don't, it isn't so important to the community to learn all this stuff. So, I mean, I don't know, I hope I haven't offended anyone's beliefs, but I can't take.
Yeah.
We don't do offended.
No, we don't. Exactly, Eva. We don't do offended here. No, some other people like to do offended and sensitivities all the time, much to my annoyance, I must confess. But no, we don't do that here. If we step on somebody's toes, we generally tell each other and we sort it out. Yes. No, but thank you very much. I mean, that's fascinating. You're obviously a polymath, a genuine polymath. One last thing is, do you describe yourself as Jewish or not? Or how do you describe yourself?
Well, I mean, I tend to think of Zionists as anti-Jews. And if you actually study the Talmud, it gives you a pretty simple definition. Jewish isn't really an issue in the Talmud. There's members of the community of Israel, Yisrael, and those are people who basically their ancestors were at Sinai. And it says pretty clearly in Nedarim 20 that if you are shameless with regard to theft, you couldn't possibly be a member of the community of Israel. And to me, a Zionist is about as shameless about theft as you can be, because not only do they steal Palestine, but they try to steal the identity of Palestinians, their heritage and history, by claiming to be descendants of Judeans. So, I can't practice Judaism anymore because I think it's dead, but I sort of feel still that I'm a member of the community of Israel, in a way. Jews, yeah. Jewish,
thank you for that. Yeah, no, you've given it, and we don't have enough time to go into all this, but yes, you've given an answer, which is good. One of our members describes himself as a biological Jew. And I think that's his way of answering that question in a very.
I don't know what it means though, because my mom and my father are just so different.
Anyway,
what's the biology that they have in common?
Sorry. The reason I asked was not to discuss Jewish identity, but actually, I met you at a Palestinian Jewish discussion group that's held in Israel, run by Ward Asada.
Yes.
And Maurice Seeley. And I got the impression that you were getting a bit of a hard time from the other Jewish members of the group because you were voicing certain views. And I was wondering, do you get a very hard time from a lot of Jewish people because of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, if you conflict with anything that Zionism claims, you're going to have grief. That's why I use my pen name all the time. I don't want my mother to get this grief, or my sister.
Yeah. So no. I mean, I was just observing the dynamic in the group.
I mean, I'm not really so much. I think that Israel's just wrong and should be gone. I argue from the standpoint of law, especially in the United States, and it causes damage to our society. Making war in the Constitution, that's dangerous.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I think you've summarized exactly what you said, the basics of what is today, and we've discussed a little bit of the background, but the relevance is what's happening today. And just said, what Israel is doing is wrong. But I'm very, very grateful for you. I shall now end try and switch off the
Recording. I think you have to save it in some way and then process it.
Here,
Maybe upload it.